like to take the group back to the night of November 7th, 2000. For the undergraduates present, this might involve a stretch of memory or probably a leap of the imagination. That may also be true for foreign visitors who weren't around for the 2000 presidential election. But if you were here and if you watched the election returns closely, as I, a native Cook County Democrat, was inclined to do, there came this interesting moment when it seemed quite likely that Al Gore had carried Florida and therefore with about a 99% certainty the national election. But if you kept watching, a moment came when the electoral vote count for Gore ticked back down. And I think, I can't remember what station I was watching, but whoever the anchor was, it took them a while to catch up, but you knew what had happened is Florida had gone from being a decided state to being a state that was back in play. Now, one of the news stories from that day, which lingered for a few days and then disappeared, involved the woman behind me who's up on the screen. This is now a great trivia question because hardly anybody can identify her or know what she's accountable for. But this is actually Teresa Lepore, who is the designer of the Great Butterfly Ballad. Here we see two versions of it. The official version's on the bottom, and the spurious version is on the top. It's a significant event because it probably cost the Democrats, most social scientists think, a few thousand votes, possibly more, in West Palm Beach County, which would have decided the election in Florida, and therefore the national popular vote and the electoral vote as well. But it didn't work out that way. So instead, over the weeks to come, we had the prolonged search for Chads. For those who watch it on C-SPAN, as you might want to do in a leisure moment, it actually had kind of a hypnotic quality. It was strangely soothing to watch these guys holding these things up and twisting them around and trying to figure out had the paper been struck out or not. So that went on for about 6 weeks, but of course that all ended in the decision in Bush v. Gore, which came out in mid-December. The day Bush v. Gore was announced was actually a nice day for me because Nina Totenberg from NPR interviewed me in the morning on great Supreme Court decisions. And then, then I was listening in the afternoon, and much to my surprise, it went bum, 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 bum. And the next thing you heard was my squeaky voice. And what I said was, you'd hope in a case like this, the Supreme Court would decide something on the basis of unanimity. This is a major decision. It's going to have important consequences. You'd hope the court could reason its way to consensus. Of course, that's exactly what doesn't happen. And that's one reason why you never want historians to predict anything. A, because we know we can't predict the future, and B, because the history is full of accidents and things you don't anticipate. And that's exactly what happened then. So that was nice publicity for me, but actually during this period, my mind was elsewhere, which is often the case when you spend your waking hours in the 18th century. I was thinking a lot about the Electoral College. And the thing that struck me about the 2000 election, well, really, a couple of things. One was it seemed to me awfully curious that, in the state of Florida, on which hung the national election, roughly 6 million people voted, and the outcome would depend upon the statistically insignificant swing of, let's say, 600 to 700 voters. I mean, if we knew one thing about Florida, we knew that the state was perfectly evenly divided in its preferences. So the idea of applying a winner-take-all rule to capture the electoral vote struck me as being kind of a curious idea when the results were themselves statistically insignificant. And then there's another aspect of the election which was also kind of interesting, which was if you look carefully at the electoral data, you'd realize that Bush's margin of victory in the Electoral College came from the fact that he carried the 20 smallest units voting in the nation. That's the states, including District of Columbia, with 3 or 4, 5 electoral votes. He carried those 13 to 7, and by the rule of the senatorial bump, which gives each state 2 extra electors just for being a state in relationship to its, representation in the Senate, there's a kind of artificial aspect to the way in which the Electoral College was constituted. So I started writing op-eds about this. Actually, I had a nice string of luck. I had 3 in the New York Times in 5 months, and they were all unsolicited, so I felt pretty good about that. And I planted some other op-eds in other places. And I tried to talk about the logic of the Electoral College. And that's what I want to do with you this afternoon in the time allotted me. Here's the basic question I want us to think about. This would involve a radical act of reinvention in American politics. It's one I think might be feasible, though Jimmy Carter once told me talking about it was a waste of time. Could Americans be persuaded to approve and ratify a constitutional amendment creating a single constituency, let's call it the United States of America, in which the president would be elected by national popular vote with every citizen's vote counting equal. You know, I realize I skipped too closely over the previous slide. This is, so votes per elector. This is just a kind of inverse correlation map of what the electoral map looks like. It tells you what is the weight of, of a vote in every given state. So the small states, Wyoming, North Dakota, D.C. look extraordinarily large here because the bang for an individual vote in terms of electors rendered is higher than it is in puny California. So the basic question. So what I want to do now is I want to do just a little bit of history because I do spend my waking hours in the 18th century, and then I want to offer 6 propositions and maybe 1 or 2 suggestions, time permitting, about what we might do. So why do we have the Electoral College at all? This is a great mystery to most Americans, but I spend a lot of time thinking about this. The important things to know, first off, we have it not because it was a great idea, not because the framers of the Constitution understood how it was going to work. We have it because it was the least unsatisfactory option available to them. Not the most satisfactory, the least unsatisfactory option available to them. Why was that the case? Well, we have to look at the alternatives. So one alternative would be, let's have a popular election for the president. This was actively discussed at the convention, but there are 2 big arguments against it. One is it's bad for the South. You know, that might be a good thing, but that isn't how they thought about it. It's bad for the South. Why? Because in the South, slaves, who form a significant part of the population, if you have one national constituency, slaves are not going to vote. So in that sense, white voters, free adult voters in the South will be disadvantaged. That's objection number 1, has some significance. The bigger one is the framers lived in a very parochial, provincial political world. And they had real doubts as to whether knowledge about candidates would be adequate at the popular level to make a national vote effective. People could vote for the president, but they assumed a lot of provincial voting. And it'd be very hard to get to a majority for any candidate. So one obvious answer to that would be, let's have election by Congress. That looks good. I mean, this won't correspond to our opinions today, but arguably you could say there can't be anybody more knowledgeable about national politics than Congress. We have a lot of doubts about their proposition today, but in a certain formal sense, it's good. So that's fine by itself, but then you run into a couple other objections. One is that the framers did want the president to be politically independent of Congress. They did think of the executive as an independent office, an independent department. And so to make the president politically dependent on Congress seemed like a bad idea. And then they also thought, which I think is interesting, is they wanted to give the president a framework for thinking the re-election would encourage the best ambitions. If it's going to be re-elected by Congress, he would only toady up to Congress. But if you give them the chance to be, if you give presidents the chance to be re-elected on the basis of having done great deeds, then by appealing to the people themselves, or at least some other system, that might work. So congressional election doesn't work very well. That leaves us with the electoral college system. It's something they adopted with some thought at the very end of their deliberations. No one knew who the electors were going to be. As George Mason says, there might be men, not even the second or perhaps even the third character. Nobody knew how they would deliberate. The one advantage to the electoral college was it would combine the different compromises over representation that the framers had already reached. Now, that's all I want to say about the history. Being a historian, I think it's always important to know the sources of our institutions. What I really want to do is say, now, just push the story forward. All those assumptions were disproved very quickly in 1796 in the first contested election. After Washington retires, John Adams on the left and Thomas Jefferson on the right run against each other. You have political parties formed. They operate very effectively. You could have had an effective national popular election then. And then, of course, we have the election of 1800, which is what really interested me. That's when what really struck me was that if you went through this state by state, you would see that the states were manipulating the rules whereby electors were chosen. That the Electoral College had become basically a vehicle for partisan manipulation. And so you get a kind of set of stories. Virginia went from choosing electors by districts to having a statewide popular vote. Virginia, of course, the home of Thomas Jefferson, who's running against Adams again. Massachusetts, Adams' home, goes from having districts to having appointed electors by the legislature. In Pennsylvania, almost failed to vote because the 2 houses of the legislature were divided. The legislature was going to appoint the electors, but the 2 houses belonged to the 2 different parties. Finally, they strike a deal. New York, most interestingly, was going to have legislative election. Aaron Burr wins, carries the legislative elections for the Republicans, Jefferson's party, his own party, at which point Alexander Hamilton writes John Jay, says, call the legislature back into special session so we can go to a district system. If we have a district system, maybe we can pull off a few electors here. My basic point here is if you look at the history of Electoral College, you see, A, the framers' original understandings were wholly wrong, or at least deeply problematic. if not wholly wrong. And B, the institution was subject to a great deal of partisan manipulation. That's the deep history. Now let's look at the story that we face today. And I just want to offer up here 6 reasons why I think we ought to be bold enough or rational enough or enterprising enough to think about reasons for changing this. And I'm sorry that I don't have anything flashy here, but these are basically concepts I'm trying to explain, and so I have to kind of lay them out in this way. So the point number 1 is, I believe, is a matter of principle. One person, one vote. The idea that everyone's vote is an equal vote wherever it is cast should be the rule of a modern democratic polity. It is the one principled rule around which I think we should all agree. Point number 2, we've become increasingly aware, I think going back to 2000, of what we call the battleground state phenomenon. The presidential elections pivot around identifying some handful of states, maybe anywhere from, let's say, 6, 7, 8, to about a dozen, that are contestable. They're contestable just for accidental reasons, just because the populations there happen to be more or less evenly divided. It's not for any reason. It's not that their political culture is special. It's not that they have special interests that the rest of the nation ought to observe. I mean, why should we care about New Hampshire being a battleground state, except its population has to be equally divided, therefore it's contestable. I think the rest of us feel this is something fundamentally harmful, dangerous, inimical to the political system. It means that the rest of us essentially sit presidential elections out. We care a lot about them. I mean, I read the news pretty, on a daily, hourly basis. I check 538.com every 2 or 3 hours during the election cycle. But the reality is that we don't really feel engaged in the election. So that's reason number 2. Reason number 3, we've become increasingly aware that just as there is partisan manipulation of the Electoral College in the 1790s, once the delegates understood that it was an institution ripe to be manipulated as best they could by rules and so on. Today we have a different form of partisan manipulation, which says the results of an election pivot on what you do in the battleground states and how you appeal to a relatively small segment of independent, moderate, unattached, often quite ignorant voters. So we have this kind of curious system where we have a new form of partisan manipulation, which is a little different from the kind that existed in the 1790s, but still a problem. Okay, so those are kind of standard objections. Now here are, though, I think are 3 reasons, 3 more positive reasons that I want all of us to think about just as citizens, why the whole idea of reform should be attractive to us as a matter of principle. One is, I happen to think that this may be a moment when both parties should have incentives to think positively about replacing the Electoral College with the national popular vote. The Democrats may feel this way because they've shown some structural advantages in the last 2 elections with President Obama, both in terms of how the Democrats are creating what is potentially a new national majority, and also in which the way the states are evolving in ways that Republican strategists like Karl Rove had never anticipated. And the Republicans, for their part, have to start thinking seriously. Would we not stand a better chance of winning the presidency with a popular national candidate than we can do through the state-bound basis of the Electoral College? When the Republicans look at the map, what they now see is something very scary, something that's not going to work to their advantage over the long run, and therefore they might want to start to rethink it. That's point number 1. Point number 2, or point number 5 up here, I should say, that I feel very, very strongly about. If we had a national presidential election, a popular vote in a single constituency, let's call it the United States of America, which happens to be a convenient term, one of the things that politicians would discover is votes cast everywhere would have the same weight. You wouldn't just have to turn out your voters in strategic constituencies or in battleground states. You would want to turn out, if you're a Republican, you want to turn out as large an electorate in Texas as you possibly could, but also in Idaho or Wyoming or Alaska, all those places the Democrats would never bother competing. So I happen to think that if we went to this kind of system, if we thought about it rationally, of course it's a difficult enterprise, but that's why I'm talking to you, to encourage this kind of thinking to take place. If we thought about it rationally, we would understand that there would be a deep incentive in the party system to think about ways to democratize our politics in a way that would be admirable. And why do I think that would be admirable? Well, here are 3 inauguration photos from 2000, 2008, and 1992, 2000, 2008. One of the things I like about this photograph is that there are 2 graduates of the Stanford History Department up on the stage here. My former student and thesis advisee, Chelsea Clinton, in the upper left, and then Dianne Feinstein down here. Now, why do I put these 3 photographs up? I do so, I think, out of a deep democratic principle to which I feel strongly committed. I teach a course with my colleague Jim Fishkin called Can the People Rule, which is essentially about the idea of democracy, where it comes from, how we might practice it today. We feel very strongly that democracy is the one best form of government. We feel deeply committed to it morally. We want to explain how it works. And I think what I want this photo to illustrate is just one last point here. If we look at the last three presidencies, one of the things I think we can really discover is that each has begun with a kind of deep partisan animus carrying over from the election into the subsequent administrations. That was certainly true of Clinton. Republicans felt they owned the presidency. It was certainly true about George Bush, because Democrats felt he and the Supreme Court and somehow hoisted the election. It was certainly true about Barack Obama for a whole variety of reasons that are painful to talk about, and so on. But I think the deeper issue here is that if we perceive a country that's divided into red and blue states, if we think about the way in which the electoral college system works, if we think about its manipulative aspects, it might be a net gain to our political culture in the broadest sense of the term to think of the presidency as the one national office in which we would all cast a vote that counts equally. Each of our votes would count the same. All American citizens would be equal. And the result would be a truly national result. We know that the distribution would not be equal across the states, but we would know that the result was truly national in a way that I think our current politics don't allow us to do so. I think that would be a great step forward for our democracy, and just as a teacher to you, as students and audience, I hope you'll think seriously about it. Thank you very much.